Welcome back. Some heated words on the floor of Canada's Parliament this week. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau took questions, and the Conservatives and New Democratic Party both came prepared. Well, joining me now for this portion of the show from Vancouver, Alise Mills is National Executive Director of Conservative Voice. From Ottawa, Sheila Gervais is a former National Director of the Liberal Party of Canada, and Charles Doran is Director of Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Alise, let me start with you. What do you make of these changes announced by Justin Trudeau? Not everybody is on board, as we just heard in that exchange in the Canadian Parliament. And as Ambassador Paul Heinbecker just told us in that interview, this is quite a radical change for Canada, looking at the fact that Canada wants to put an end to airstrikes, wants closer relationships with the UN. What do you think?
Well, I heard the former ambassador's interview with you, and I had many questions and comments out of that, of course. But to start with airstrikes in Iraq, I don't know if it's a radical change so much as he made a campaign promise, not necessarily thinking he might be Prime Minister and having to stick with it, and has sort of put this incoherent policy together. So to give you an example, we're sending helicopters in there. Well, that's a pretty dangerous proposition to put in there, since the likelihood of helicopters being damaged from launchers down below, even if there is no long-range missiles, is quite likely. We're tripling the troops on the front lines. That seems to be combat. We're pulling out our jets just when, and our military leaders here in Canada agree, just when the airstrikes were making a difference, and we were standing with our allies, but we're not doing that anymore. We've increased the humanitarian aid, which is all fine and dandy, but you have to create a safe haven for humanitarian aid to be able to make it through. Mr. Trudeau, or Prime Minister Trudeau, was unable to answer the question as to why he would do all of these things and yet not maintain airstrikes, which are a far safer proposition for Canada. And if we're claiming that we do not want to go into combat, the airstrikes, or that we're trying to avoid a more heavy position in combat, the airstrikes would have been a better answer. When you get into his positions on issues around Syria, Russia, the relationship between Canada and Russia, for example, right, where he has taken a more bended knee approach with Russia, those issues become concerning. Looking at what's happened with Iran this past week, Mr. Trudeau has been absolutely silent on the behaviors around the Iranian leadership as well. Okay,
let me go to Sheila. Sheila, the interim leader of the opposition Conservative Party, says Trudeau's decision would, and she was talking specifically about the decision to stop airstrikes in Syria, would, and I'm quoting her, said, would blunt the sharp end of the spear in the fight against ISIS and disappoint allies. It's a point that Alise just made as well. The airstrikes, as Alise told us, is making a difference right now and is helping the allies. Do you believe that to be the case?
Well, I think there are a number of things that are wrapped up in there. The fact that Canada will be changing certain aspects of its involvement in the quote-unquote fight against ISIS does not mean that bombing will be discontinued. There are other members of the alliance that will be taking up the bombing mission. So the airstrikes will continue. It's simply that Canada's involvement in that aspect of the fight will not continue. Canada's involvement in the airstrike mission was about 5% of the airstrikes. We had 6 fighter jets involved. We will be involved militarily in many other aspects that bolster what Canadians believe to be their interests in the region. So it's a little disingenuous to say that the only way that ISIL and terrorism in general, because it's not only ISIL that we need to be looking at, but it's a bit disingenuous to say that the only way that we can combat them or fight them is from the air, dropping bombs.
Okay, let me get Charles into this. Charles, is the policy laid out by Justin Trudeau a clear policy, or is it, as Alise told us, incoherent?
Well, first of all, it's a traditional policy for the Liberal Party. to emphasize foreign assistance and humanitarian kinds of considerations. So if you look at the history of the party's position, this is not radically new. And what should be emphasized, I listened very carefully to the Prime Minister's question and answer period in the Parliament. And when somebody said, well, what happens if those helicopters, for example, get into a conflict? He said, well, if we're fired upon, we will respond. We'll protect our soldiers. So the events could, in fact, force Canada a bit to come off of this policy. I think symbolically, this is a significant change, nonetheless, in terms of its position.
Significant because Canada will not, I'll get to you in a moment, Alise, because Canada will not initiate firepower, but will respond.
Well, because it is, in fact, not participating actively in the bombing.
Okay.
And in other words, the attitude toward force use is somewhat different. And that is something that allies and so on will have to take into consideration. On the other hand, it's not novel or new for a Liberal government in Canada to take this kind of position.
Okay, Alise, go ahead.
I don't disagree with the last point there as well, but if I can, mention that, for example, it's a very trite comment to say, well, we'll fire back. It is needless. We do not need to be sending helicopters in there. The vast majority, and I mean the vast majority of Canadians, overwhelmingly, month after month, show support for Canada's bombing missions, or airstrikes, I should say. So Canadians have many reasons for supporting it. One of them, they feel that that's their comfort level. Number two, they're proud of that contribution. And just to update our panel here, Prime Minister Trudeau and the Liberal government have already ceased those airstrikes without continuing on with the vote in the House. So that showed up in last night's debate in the House of Commons. But if I can also talk about, Sheila referred to the fight against terrorism, I think we'd be somewhat remiss in not talking about how this connects also with their campaign promises around our national security bill, Bill C-51, and some of the changes that they wanted to make, and that they've been relatively silent about that. We need to update our national security, and that goes into some of the discussions on the fight against terrorism. It's a domestic issue as much as it is a foreign issue for us in Canada right now, and there's a lot of pushing and pulling as to which way we need to go. And unfortunately, again, the Prime Minister has been largely silent about what direction he's going to take. And I think that the Canada's contribution isn't 5%. It was actually 6%. And I think Canadians have shown time and time again that they're very proud of that mission. And that's how the Trudeau Liberals have sort of positioned it. We're very proud of you, but it was so insignificant. And I think his detractors get a lot of traction when he makes comments like that.
Okay, let me get Sheila's response to that. Sheila, has the Prime Minister told us how he's going to fight terrorism, for instance, both domestically and outside the country?
Well, I think through his actions he is, and I might say in regard to Alise's comments that Canada is looking at its overall security requirements. And doing a review of our overall security requirements on a domestic front. Our Minister of Defence has today told us, and as a matter of fact, I might say it is the Department of Defence, it is not the Department of Offence. So we always have to be looking in Canadians' interests. We will be maintaining the requirements that we have for members of the Defence and the Reserve. We will be looking at all of that in the context of an overall security review. So I think that all of these things will be coming together in the context of Canada's overall global policy that it's implementing. What I wanted to say in that regard is that you can see from some of the language that Alise and the Conservative Party are using that language is very, very important. So as I say, when we talk about Canada's defence policy, as I say, we're not talking about Canada's offence policy. When we talk about
Sheila, I
our
wasn't speaking of the defence policy. I wasn't speaking of the defence policy. I was talking about Bill C-51 and the national security CSIS and CSEC and the expansion of intelligence and surveillance and what we do on the ground to stop the growth of domestic terrorism, and we also prevent those coming into the country that have ill intentions. That's what I was referring to. I'm not talking about military expenditures or decreasing the budget.
But these
Go ahead, Sheila.
But these reviews are underway. They are being addressed by Cabinet. They are being addressed by a Cabinet that is taking its lead from Canadians, from the direction that Canadians gave them during the election. And that is as true of, to go back to, the combat mission and the fight against terrorism and ISIL in the Middle East. Where Canadians are the ones who said to the Liberal Party that while yes, they were proud of the effort that Canada was making there, that they were not in favor of bombing missions.
Okay, Charles.
So yes, this is how Canadian policy will be crafted in Canada.
What I would suggest is this, that events will in fact shape policy. And a good example is for example, with the relations with Russia. If, in fact, the dispute with the Ukraine, for example, were to heat up again, I think this would put Canada in a situation where it's going to have to participate for a lot of reasons, including domestic politics. So right now, it's possible to stake out a position that's different from the previous government in Canada. But world events may, in fact, force governments to take a kind of role in which Canada has to use force and so on.
Right, but Charles, looking very broadly at what pushes or what's going to be driving Canadian foreign policy, that piece that I mentioned in Foreign Policy magazine with Ambassador Heinbecker also said that the previous Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, put the emphasis on what it called hard power over soft power. Is that going to change now under Trudeau?
Well, I think that the Trudeau government would like to change this. They'd like international relations to, in fact, accept a situation where soft power is more feasible. And in fact, it's good to emphasize this. Canada's a very well-liked country. But the problem is...
Soft power for Canada means more involvement in humanitarian missions, peacekeeping missions.
Right. But the problem is that when you get involved, especially with your allies, and they're hard-pressed and they need support, these policies could change. So I think what one is going to see is a government that, in fact, holds all of its options open over time. It must, depending upon what circumstances are going to demand.
And that's where we're going to have to leave it.
And a government that engages.
Very quickly, Sheila. I've got 10 seconds.
All right, I was just going to say, and a government that actually engages. So we don't close embassies, we open embassies, such as we're doing in Doran, and we engage with countries, whether we agree with them or not, such as Russia.
I'm going to have to end it there. Sheila Gervais, Alise Mills, Charles Doran, thanks to all of you for joining us.